Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kennedy School. I'm David Elwood, Dean of the Kennedy School, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I'm especially thrilled to be here tonight because we're welcoming back Ambassador Bob Blackwell, who's had a very distinguished career, the most distinguished of which was, of course, here at the Kennedy School, but there's many other parts of his career that are worthy of mention. And indeed, this is an especially propitious time for him to be here because President Bush will travel to visit India later this week, and it's a very, very important visit. Obviously, India is the world's largest democracy, and it has become, in recent years, a critical strategic partner, and in defining both nuclear security and security more broadly, and advancing democracies around the world. Part of the reason we're so fortunate, of course, to have Robert Blackwell is that he served as ambassador in 2001 through 2003. Now, we also have here at the school Graham Allison, who many of you know, and before Bob left, he sent a note to Graham with his objectives for what he'd like to accomplish. Graham dismissed this note as, I think the terms he used was delusional. The goals that then to be Ambassador Blackwell set for himself was to help the President think about improve the U.S.-Indian relationship and make it a strategic partnership, to get the sanctions listed, and develop robust business and military relationships. All of these have come to pass. So once again, Graham was very wise, but not exactly prescient. He was, in many ways, it was his work that led to the joint statement between President Bush and Prime Minister Singh in July of 2005, declaring their resolve to transform the relationship between the countries and establish a global partnership, of which the next chapter comes this week. Indeed, Nicholas Burns, Undersecretary of State, has said that Blackwell helped to transform U.S.-Indian relations into a nascent strategic partnership. And then, because he hadn't done enough in India, they transferred him to another spot. After serving as ambassador, the President called on Blackwell to become the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Planning and the Presidential Envoy to Iraq. In this role, he helped to transition power from the Coalition Provisional Authority to the Iraqi people and help Iraq develop its interim government. Now, before his work in India and Iraq, he also served as began his work as international relations as a foreign service officer. He rose to the rank of U.S. ambassador and chief negotiator at the Conventional Force negotiations of the Warsaw Pact in Vienna. And special assistant to the President, George W. Bush. He was a special assistant to George W. Bush for European and Soviet affairs in the crucial closing years of the Cold War. And for his contribution to German unification, he was awarded the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit by the Federal Republic of Germany. So it is indeed a remarkable career he's had. Now he's retired from the Foreign Service and is now president of the Washington firm Barber, Griffin & Rogers International and counselor of Council on Foreign Relations. But of course, we all remember him for his remarkable contributions to the Kennedy School. He's served at various times at the Kennedy School for 14 years on our faculty, founded 3 major initiatives, a Middle East initiative, a Chinese security studies program, and the executive program for U.S. and Russian general officers. One quick word about the latter. You may have heard a year or so back, a Russian submarine was in trouble. Somehow or other, an American rescue ship was sent. This was because, according to the Russian, he had gotten to know the American admiral during one of the executive programs here at the Kennedy School. Again, something that Bob Blackwell founded. So again, international relations at every level. Now, one of the things we do at the Kennedy School is provide dinners on the Dean to people that have unusually high ratings. One of the good things for Bob not being here is I don't have to put out quite as much money for dinner on the Dean because Bob traditionally had very high ratings in his international security and other kinds of things. He continues to serve as a board member of the Belfer Center. So it is my very great pleasure and real honor to welcome back Ambassador Bob Blackwell.
Thank you very much, David. It's good to be home. Mostly when I have been in this space, I've been sitting out where you're sitting, trying to think of a particularly tough question to ask the speaker. But I ask for your mercy in that respect tonight. It's a pleasure to be here, of course, when one returns to a place that one spent many years. Just memories come flooding back. But perhaps the most powerful one is the memories of this particular institution's commitment to excellence in public policy, its passion for that. And I have missed that and found other passions along the way and other intellectual endeavors, but none, I think, with the power, the staying power of that particular experience here at the Kennedy School. But tonight I'm speaking of another passion of mine, which is the U.S.-India relationship and the rise of India. And of course the President leaves tomorrow for India in a historic visit. I want to speak about that in about 20 minutes or so, and then have a conversation with you about that subject. Let me start, though, by saying headlines. The wonderful Dick Neustadt, who was one of my chief mentors here. I arrived at the school and teaching my first course, and I said, "Dick, how will I know if I have the attention of the students?" And Dick Neustadt said, "Well, I'm not sure." Of course, he knew that he always did. I said, "Well, what if they start looking at their watches?" And Dick said, "Well, don't worry about that. Being a Harvard faculty member, you should just conclude that your brilliance is so overwhelming that they're worried about time running out in the classroom." And then and I really felt quite confident then. Then Dick said, "Now if they take their watch off and start hitting it, that's another matter." So I'll watch in particular to see if any of you take off your watches. India. There are many Indias. An author said India is a plural. Let me remind you, at least those of you who need reminding, India, 1.1 billion people, 15% of the world's population in India, 17 major languages, depending on how you count them, 22,000 dialects, and all of the world's religions in number. The second largest Muslim population in the world after Indonesia, the second largest Shia population in the world after Iran, 20 million Christians, and so forth. India's economy is where I'm going to start, because that's the greatest preoccupation of most Indians. It's now the world's 12th largest economy, third largest in Asia, growing at about 8% in the last few years, 6% real growth over the last 15 years, with about 5% inflation. The well-known Goldman Sachs study in 2003 projected that India will have the fastest growing economy over the next 50 years. And in 10 years, it will be larger than Italy's, in 15 larger than Britain's, and by 2050, 5 times larger than Japan. This is being driven, which is quite unusual in Asia, not by exports, by internal consumption, which makes up 67% of India's GDP, for instance, compared to China's 42%. There's one other thing at the outset that one needs to say about India, especially as it concerns the United States, and that is how popular the United States is in India. There was a well-known poll, the Pew Global Attitudes survey of June of last year. It went around the world asking folks whether they had a favorable attitude regarding the United States. And as you can imagine, given the current international system in Europe, I don't know if they ever quite got single digits, but there were a lot of countries in the 20s. 71% of Indians had a favorable attitude to the United States in these polls. Only Americans themselves, which were 83%, had a higher favorable percentage. By the way, that 83%, I haven't been gone so long from here that I don't remember that. I doubt if Cambridge would produce such a number. I think they would probably be significantly less than the Indian approval rate for the United States. So there's this extraordinary Indian economic machine which is producing a middle class today, depending on how you define it, of 200 to 300 million people. Its middle class is now bigger than the total populations of France, Germany, and Britain combined. It has brought 100 million people out of poverty in the last decade, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. So that's one India. There is, of course, another, and that is an India in which 300 million people live on less than $1 a day. 40% of the world's poorest people live in India. It has the second and perhaps today the first largest, first largest HIV/AIDS population in the world. It's gone over 4 million. On the UN Human Development Index, India rates last year 124 out of 177. And here's a stunner. Female literacy in India across the country is 54%. So you have, for purposes of this point, these two Indias next to one another, sometimes within 100 yards of one another. One throbbing, pulsating, becoming ever more part of the global economy, and another of the kind I described of abject poverty. There's no doubt that the Indian political elite thinks that its most important task in the period ahead is not what I'm mostly going to talk about tonight, which is the U.S.-India relationship, but it is rather bringing these millions and millions of Indians out of poverty and into the mainstream of Indian life. Now, that brings me to the U.S.-India relationship, an appropriate topic since the President is leaving for there tomorrow. Prime Minister Vajpayee, the previous Indian Prime Minister, said famously in an address to Congress about 5 years ago that the United States and India are natural allies, a phrase which remains quite controversial in India itself, but myself, I think, appropriately describes the long-term character of this relationship. Let me tell you why, and I'll use, if I might, an imaginary matrix being here at the Kennedy School, in which perhaps across the top are American vital national interests, and down the side are the countries of the world. So let me just, for purposes of this analysis, say 5 vital American national interests. Graham Allison and I worked a lot on this when I was here in various iterations of American vital national interests. I'll name 5. Prosecuting the global war on terror and reducing the staying power and effectiveness of the terrorist killers. Second, preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction, including to terrorist groups. Third, dealing with the rise of Chinese power. Fourth, ensuring the reliable supply of energy from the Persian Gulf. And finally, fifth, keeping the global economy on track. So that's across the top of this imaginary matrix, our American vital national interests. Down the left side are the countries of the world. Which ones share with us, we Americans, those vital national interests and the willingness to do something about threats to them in the period ahead for their own reasons? And my argument, as I'll now develop in a few minutes, is that India may lead the list in the congruity of vital national interests. Henry Kissinger argues, one of my mentors, that a cooperative U.S.-India relationship is in the cards over the long term because, quote, the geopolitical objectives of India, which they are pursuing in a very hard-headed way, are quite parallel to our own, unquote. So let me just go through them briefly. First, with respect to terrorism, India in the last 15 years has lost more people to terrorism than any other country in the world, 40 to 50,000 dead. Although cross-border terrorism into Kashmir has receded significantly in the last year or two, India remains an abiding target for terrorists and their supporters in governments who view it as a historic, India as a historic oppressor of the Muslim population, especially in Kashmir. Let me just say that when I was in India, I discovered that the terrorists coming across into India from Pakistani territory often brought along with them a variety of things, including what I can only call broadsides, which were almost comic books of the inevitability of the Al-Qaeda victory. And these comic books often had a cover with Osama bin Laden, the very large sword, vanquishing three trembling individuals with flags, one American, one Israeli, and one Indian. And I think that captures the long-term struggle that India continues to have with terrorism, and means that they need no urging from us about the importance of winning the global effort to end Islamic extremist terrorism. Weapons of mass destruction. Imagine a group of terrorists have obtained a nuclear weapon and are debating in some dark room or cave where to detonate it. Of course, someplace in the United States would be the first choice, perhaps. Second most likely destination, perhaps Israel. But New Delhi and Mumbai would certainly be part of that conversation because of the place that India occupies in jihadist ideology. So this too will be an area in which India will be on the side of the United States over the long term. The rise of Chinese power. Let me just say here, there's no faster way to empty a strategic drawing room in New Delhi than to try to talk to Indians about containing China. They think this is a daffy idea and one that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But that does not mean that behind the elevated rhetoric of the Indian government about China that they are unserious about China's increased weight, both economically and diplomatically, in Asia. Indeed, I would say that perhaps only the Japanese think in such a sustained strategic way about the rise of Chinese power, as do Indians. Energy security, the Gulf, both the United States and India are hugely dependent on foreign energy from the Gulf. Quarter of our own oil is from the Middle East. 75% of India's energy, crude oil, is from the Middle East. And then there's the economy, which is self-evident. in addition to those five vital national interests, which I think we share, there is, of course, also our democratic values. And the United States and India operate from the same solid moral foundation. India is a remarkable democracy, more than 1 billion people, and there aren't so many such democracies of that vitality in that part of the world, especially one that sustains a heterogeneous, multilingual, and secular society. Sunil Kildani, the author of The Idea of India, calls India, quote, a bridgehead of effervescent liberty on the Asian continent, unquote. And George W. Bush, for whom I worked during his first and his second, but his first campaign for the presidency, was struck quite forcefully by this extraordinary democracy in action, 1 billion people in a functioning, successful democracy. So, for those reasons that I've given you, I think that India and the United States over the long term are destined to be ever closer partners. Let me be more specific now about the defense side of the relationship and say a few things that may not be quite so familiar to you. The Indians are extremely serious about their own defense. This is a country that had to fight 3 wars to maintain its territorial integrity and has had major terrorist activities against them for 15 years. The Indian defense budget increased 17% in real terms in 04-05 to $17 billion. And 05-06, it's $19 billion, which is almost an 8% increase. So they take the modernization of their armed forces seriously. But let me stress something that's probably equally important. India has a 1 million-man army that fights. In fact, if you put aside the American and British armed forces and the 2 Gulf Wars, the army in the world that's had the most combat experience in the last 20 years is the Indian Army. I contrast this, if I may, with the postmodernist armies of some of our European allies who do not have either the political will or the societal support to actually conduct combat activities. I mentioned before energy security, and just to make that point a little bit more detail, India and the Persian Gulf, just a few. Jajwant Singh, who became a close friend of mine and was the George Shultz of India, if I may call him that. He was the finance minister, the defense minister, and the foreign minister. Reminded me once when I was talking about the Persian Gulf, his father in 1919 was in Basra. And just to remind you that British expeditionary force was made up almost entirely of Indians in the 1920s. That part of the world, the Gulf, was governed from Calcutta for over 100 years, most of it was. 3 million Indians live in the Gulf today. And as I said, 75% of India's oil comes from the Gulf. Let me, a little parlor game that some of you would pass with flying colors, but maybe not everybody. How long does it take to fly from India to the Gulf? I won't be passing out a blue book for you to answer, but let me give you some mileage. And every country that I'm about to name regards the Persian Gulf as vital to their national interests. So it's 7,000 miles away from Washington, D.C. Doha. I picked Doha. It's 3,200 miles away from London. It's 2,700 miles away from Berlin. It's 2,200 miles away from Moscow. It's 1,600 miles away from New Delhi. And it's 1,400 miles away from Mumbai. So for you Americans, if you don't take our usual natural preoccupation to put the United States in the middle of the geopolitical map and actually think of the way India is. It's very close. By the way, it's 3 hours flight from Mumbai to Doha. And so those of you who got that right, get an A in whatever courses you're taking here. Okay, so the point I wanted to make here is that this Indian military establishment and political will takes international affairs seriously. They do not believe that international law is the answer to every international disagreement. History has taught them otherwise, and so they're prepared. Let me stress, they've been invaded for centuries, but never have invaded, and so this is defensive in character, but they regard as prudent, and it has the support of the people of India, which is, given the economic circumstances I described earlier, quite striking. Let me now move in most of my remaining time to an issue that is on the front page of the Indian press every day, and which also has figured prominently in the American media treatment of the President's visit to India, and that is the July 18th agreement of last year on civil nuclear cooperation between the United States and India. So let me just say a bit about that. First of all, I think it would be proper to call it a radical departure from previous American and Indian, for that matter, but for these purposes, previous American foreign policy. Just remember that for 30 years the United States was in the lead through the NPT regime, which it had the major part in creating, the non-proliferation regime, in casting India outside the community of civilized nations with respect to nuclear weapons and civil nuclear power, to ensure that India was a pariah in the international system in this regard. And the United States, in this effort, was successful. And India did not have the opportunity to enjoy technology, civil nuclear technology, or know-how from the international community. This has been true since the NPT was signed in 1968. The agreement that President Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh signed on July 18th changes this dramatically. And what it does is that if approved by Congress, and it has to be approved by Congress, it would provide India with access to nuclear know-how, fuel, and technology, which it has been denied for 30 years. Now, let me say that because it was denied technology does not mean that it had no indigenous nuclear activities on its own. It built its own reactors, and of course it also built a minimum nuclear deterrent on its own. But the Bush administration came to the view that it was unreasonable to continue to ask India to bear the burden of a global non-proliferation regime in perpetuity while it suffered sanctions under the same regime. And it's important to stress here that India has, through this entire period, an exemplary record in not passing on this sensitive technology to other nations. Libya and Iran, for example, have approached New Delhi and others over the years seeking assistance in developing nuclear weapons capabilities. Indian leaders since Indira Gandhi have refused. Now, there have been critiques, surely, of this agreement, and I'll just mention them briefly just for your consideration, and we can pursue them if you wish. There are essentially four of them. At least I think it's fair to say there are four of them. The first one is the objective of American nuclear policy toward India for these years, especially the last 15, was to try to reverse and then end India's nuclear weapons capability. Of course, that effort failed, but the U.S. Resolutely pursued it for 15 years. There are still some who criticize the July 18th agreement because although it is not designed to assist India in its nuclear weapons capability, it does not seek to punish it for it. So that's critique number one. The second is that our difficulties with Iran and North Korea, both with either existing nuclear weapons or, in Iran's case, the attempt to acquire them, that our efforts to deal with that would be more complicated if India were brought in from the cold, if I may put it like that, and made a part of the civil nuclear regime. I find this unconvincing. I don't think that the leaders of Iran and North Korea are being affected by whatever's agreed between the United States and India. The third critique is that the agreement for India would have to be replicated for Pakistan. Again, for those of you who know the notorious activities of A.Q. Khan in Pakistan, I don't think that's a serious critique. And the last is that countries that had decided not to try to acquire nuclear weapons or had reversed early efforts to do so, like South Africa and Brazil, would suddenly, because of the U.S.-India agreement, decide to resume their nuclear activities. Again, I find that unconvincing. Those are the critiques. The Undersecretary for Political Affairs, the State Department, Nick Burns, a very gifted diplomat, has been in New Delhi and attempting to negotiate this agreement. He said before he arrived in Delhi at the middle of last week that we were 90% there. Of course, those of us who study diplomatic history know that last 10% is always the toughest, and they're still negotiating. I don't know whether there will be an agreement for the president's visit or not, but I would conclude on this point with some more broader observations. I think it's no surprise, if I can be the diplomatic historian for a moment, that this agreement is opposed by skeptics in both nations. Path-breaking international agreements of this magnitude always provoke opposition. Bureaucrats resist because they intrinsically want to think and do tomorrow what they thought and did yesterday. Old bureaucrats do not fade away, they just dig in. And this has happened in both New Delhi and in Washington. And some specialists outside of government who have spent a lifetime mastering one set of thoughts apparently find it impossible to acquire another. But I would say statesmanship never emerges from slow-grinding interagency processes and shop-worn shibboleths. It requires visionary leaders to make tough choices and demonstrate political will. As Henry Kissinger puts it, quote, "The task of the leader is to get his people from where they are to where they have not been," unquote. This was the case regarding Harry Truman's creation of NATO, Richard Nixon's détente with the Soviet Union and his opening to China, Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, and George H.W. Bush's determination to unify Germany within the North Atlantic Alliance. In my judgment, it is equally true of the July 18 Civil Nuclear Agreement and the significance of President George W. Bush's visit this week to India. Thank you.
We are also, is this mic on now? Okay. Next, we're going to briefly have Xenia Dormandy share a few remarks. Xenia is the Executive Director for Research at the Belfer Center. And until August of 2005, she served as the Director for South Asia at the National Security Council, where she played a key role in coordinating the visit of Indian Prime Minister Singh. She is also a graduate of the Kennedy School of Government, where she got a master's in public policy, concentrating in international security, political economy, negotiation, and conflict resolution. Ladies and gentlemen, Xenia Dormandy.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Bob. I'm going to speak very briefly, because I know that there are going to be lots of questions, but I want to do two quick things. One is to give you just a little bit of history, and as I go through this history, you might note when Ambassador Blackwell became ambassador to India, and that there's some similarity in when the U.S.-India relationship took off, and that nomination and the ambassador going out to India. So I think most people would agree that if you go back to March 2000, President Clinton made a 5-day trip to New Delhi. He was the third U.S. president to ever visit India, and President Bush will be the fourth. It was a spectacular trip, and he is well remembered by many Indians. And this was really, I think, for many, the beginning of the realization of just how important India could be to U.S. foreign policy. 2001, a certain individual on my right was appointed U.S. ambassador to India, and this really led to a huge step forwards in bilateral relations. In addition to the change of U.S.-India relationship, we had a change in U.S.-Pakistan relationship, and under his leadership, we managed to do what others have now followed us in dehyphenating our relationship with India and with Pakistan, which has made a huge difference to what we are now able to do and what the President will do, hopefully, later this week. Ambassador Blackwell was also ambassador when the September 2002 National Security Strategy came out of the White House, which, if you want to read it, which I recommend, and I'm sure many of your professors have assigned it, for the first time recognizes explicitly India and South Asia as important interests to the United States. Shortly afterwards, we started discussions on what became the next step in strategic partnership, and I believe that Ambassador Blackwell started that process also. And that was the beginning of what we now have as this broad relationship, but it involved civil nuclear cooperation, civil space, high technology commerce, and missile defense. That was actually launched in January of 2004, as the next steps in strategic partnership, and led quite directly to the July agreement in 2005 that the ambassador's just spoken about, and the breakthrough with the US-India summit that the President is now going to take the next step on later this week. I want to jump from there to the President's trip, and what does this mean? And Bob's very eloquently put down the reasons that we think this is so important and that this relationship is so important. And he's also focused quite clearly on what is going to be the most controversial part of this visit, which is, can we or can we not achieve the nuclear deal that we laid out in July of last year? What I suspect the press will not cover, and what I think is most important, and I think based on what Bob's just said, he believes is possibly most important, is the rest of the relationship, is the reality that this US-India relationship is much broader than just the civil nuclear, but goes into the military, goes into the security. And so if I think about where we can go and where we will go in the next 2 to 5 years, regardless, in my view, of whether the civil nuclear deal goes through, this is it in very brief terms. The first is obviously civil nuclear, if we can make that happen. The second is to follow through on our strategic vision. And as has been laid out, we have a very similar strategic vision and very, very similar goals, which is not to say that we have the same strategies or tactics in achieving those goals. So, for example, what do we do with Iran, with Burma, in the energy field, in the non-proliferation field? The second is economics. And for all of the reasons that were just laid out, the growth of India's middle class, the education in India, albeit maybe not female education. In the economic sphere, the US-India relationship is going to be extremely robust. In the military area, and I won't go into that because it's already been covered, and in science and technology, particularly the biotechnology area. And it's in these 4 areas that I really see this relationship taking off on the ground in concrete terms. I'm going to leave it with that, but I would like to maybe just propose a question that one of you might want to pose to the ambassador, which is back in 2000, Ambassador Blackwell and Graham Allison wrote a thin book about what were the U.S. vital national interests. And if you look at that book, and I've read that book, and it's fascinating, there's no mention of India anywhere. And yet, we seem to have, shortly afterwards, a burgeoning relationship. So I would just love to know, how did you make that step?
Should I go ahead?
You should go ahead, yes.
Well, I think that particular document, which actually I've gone through, and I'm surprised you could still find it, because I've gone through most of the libraries in the West seeking to find this document and to destroy it. But clearly I haven't succeeded entirely, and you still have what I now regard as a contraband
You actually
copy.
assigned it in your class when I took your class.
By the way, what she didn't say was that she is a survivor of the Blackwell Allison Bataan Death March course, and somebody who excelled in it. It was Graham, and I just say it like this, it was that particular document, which, if you look back on it, I think parts of it are fine, showed our limitations, I think, and did not recognize what was happening in India and how it would consequentially affect the United States. I might say that when I was asked by the President what I would like to do, and there were a variety of alternatives and ambassadorships, I told him that I wanted to go to India because of my interest in great powers, not by any means of my command of Indian history and culture and language. And that actually came in quite handy, because I have spent most of my intellectual inquiry in foreign relations on the study of the interaction between and among great powers. And that was the framework which I came to see India in. I'll say one last thing about this, which was, it is beguiling to wonder what would have happened to this relationship without 9/11. Because 9/11's impact in India was to make ordinary Indians believe they now had someone else who recognized the effects of international terror. And they had felt lonely and abandoned for a very long time in this respect. And President Bush immediately recognized this, articulated it, and it gave an extraordinary boost to the bilateral relationship.
So we now have time for questions. There are microphones in 4 locations, one here, one up there, one there, and one there. Just to remind you of the ground rules, first, a good question has several characteristics. It starts by identifying yourself. Second, it is short. It is 1 question long, and it ends with a question mark.
Charles Cogan, Kennedy School. Does the recent visit of Jacques Chirac to India have anything to do with this, with the fate of this treaty? Does it impinge in any way on the treaty, its supposed offer of nuclear assistance to India? The French press has played this down, saying that this is not a competitive gesture on the part of Chirac, but I'd like to know what your opinion is.
The French president in the last month was in India and signed a general civil nuclear cooperative agreement with India. The French are very interested in selling reactors and nuclear technology, fuel, to India. However, they are serious members of the nuclear suppliers group, so I don't think that they will go forward without an agreement. with us, and their own. So they wait with great anticipation, Chuck, to see whether that happens or not. They're not alone. The Russians, too, very much hope that this agreement is finalized between the United States and India and then goes forward among the nuclear suppliers. A point I didn't have time to mention, but I mention it now, is that Mohammad Al-Baradei, the Secretary General of the International Atomic Energy Commission, is another strong supporter of this agreement because he thinks bringing India in formally into the international civil nuclear regime is a plus. So there are a variety of countries led by the French and the Russians who are very anxious to sell nuclear technology to India. I hope American counterparts will also be in that competition.
Right over here.
Yeah, Safia Aftab from the Kennedy School. I study here. There are any number of reasons why the U.S. should improve its relations with India. India's spectacular economic performance is one of them, of course. I was somewhat discomfited by your remark about the Al-Qaeda pamphlets with pictures with mention of America, India, and Israel in one group. I'm from Pakistan. I could take you into a bazaar in Peshawar and show you exactly the same pamphlets with pictures of General Musharraf, King Fahad, etc. All I'm trying to say is that this characterization of America, India, and Israel together in a war of terror against them is, I think, it makes me very uncomfortable. I think the front line in the war against extremism is still in Muslim countries. I think Muslim countries in general are more victims than people realize. You had one big incident, very tragic, in 9/11. We face that every day. We just had 30 people dead on the 10th of Muharram in Pakistan, 200 in Iraq. We are fighting that war. So I think this us against them thing with India, Israel, and America on one side, and particularly in India, which has, as you said, the second largest Muslim population in the world, I think this characterization it makes me very uncomfortable. Just like to say that.
Well, I love this. I used to do this too. This is a Harvard question where you make a statement and at the end you realize that you have to say, "Don't you agree?" thus meeting David's question mark.
Yes.
I do agree, and I felt very uncomfortable about it when I saw these things, and so I agree with you. This was not a characterization by anybody except these folks who were coming across the border to kill innocent civilians. I also want to agree with you that the most important arenas for struggle against international terrorism are in the Muslim world. I agree entirely with that, including in Pakistan, and I have great admiration. It wasn't the subject of my talk tonight, but I have great admiration for President Musharraf's courage. He has very serious people trying to kill him every day, and this has not made him waver in his commitment on behalf of his country, and so I admire that. Finally, I would say that, and we should have another conversation off this particular venue, but it seems to me that if you look across the Muslim world and say, well, where will this debate among Muslims have its epicenter or its epicenters? Certainly Pakistan is one of them, and how this turns out inside your country is going to be absolutely crucial, in my opinion, to how it turns out across the entire Muslim world.
Can I add one thing quickly, which is to say that one of the most interesting developments over the last 4 years has been the change such that the U.S. can have a close, burgeoning relationship with India and with Pakistan. And if you start to look, China is now doing the same thing, Japan is now beginning to do the same thing. That gives a lot more freedom to the two relationships. And the president is not only visiting India on this trip, but he is also visiting Pakistan. And if you heard what he said, I think in the Asia Center at end of last week, he is also talking very different, but nevertheless a strategic relationship with Pakistan. And this is a huge change as well.
Right over here.
Hi. Thank you for coming, Ambassador. My name is Raul Prabhakar, and I'm a student at Harvard College.
Sure.
My question is, how and can and should the United States use India with its growing influence and as the world's largest democracy as a check on China's influence in the global economy? And if so, how would the U.S. go about it?
Well, if I may, Harvard professors always quarrel with the way questions are put, and I wouldn't feel entirely at home unless I did that. How can the United States use India? Not at all is the answer, which I know you were, for epigrammatic reasons, doing a short question, which we insist on. But I think it's worth developing. There are many influences on current Indian policy, but one of them is certainly their colonial experience. And again, I mentioned Jajwant Singh once before, but when he was finance minister, I went to see him, and I, as my predecessors and successor did and do, I was complaining to him about the barriers to foreign direct investment in India. And Jajwant said, he was a great phrase maker, said, Bob, when you say foreign direct investment, you think General Electric. And when we Indians hear foreign direct investment, we think the East India Company. And that is a historical, cultural fact that makes the Indians enormously sensitive to the notion that they're going to be some pawn or cat's paw for American policy. It's part of the debate now. Now to China. I would put it like this. There are two historic forces occurring in Asia, and I would, by the way, add a third, the debate within the Muslim world about the future of Islam, and especially political Islam. But there are two. One's the rise of China, the other's the rise of India. They're directly related. Indians are determined to have the best possible relationship they can with the Chinese. However, they hedge against the future, because nobody knows what kind of government will be in China in 10 years' time, including, by the way, the current Chinese leadership. So while preparing and doing everything they can for a congenial relationship with China, they hedge against an uncertain future. What does that mean with respect to us? And here's what I would say. The Indians, as I mentioned in my presentation, are utterly disinterested in confrontational partnerships with the United States about China. They think it'll be self-fulfilling. However, if we go on developing the kind of relationship that I've been describing tonight, and if 10 to 15 years down the line, despite America's best effort and India's best effort and the efforts of others, we have an antagonistic, hostile China, the United States and India and other like-minded nations will naturally cooperate. It won't be a formal treaty arrangement as we have other parts of the world. And that's another reason why this relationship is so important. How the international community deals with the rise of Chinese power is an enormous challenge. And it's, just to be banal, different fundamentally and morally from India, because India is a democracy.
Right up here.
Hi, I'm Anna Mendy. I'm a student at the college, and an article from last week's Economist titled "The Pitfalls Awaiting George Bush in the Subcontinent" asserts the following: Pakistan is infinitely more fragile than India, but right now of much greater strategic significance to America. I was wondering whether you could comment on that.
It says that Pakistan is of much more strategic
significance to America
than India. Well, it's a false alternative. It's just not the way policymakers think about this. And you don't have, believe me, in the White House Situation Room, nobody sits around and says, well, which is more important to us, because we have to work a lot less hard on the president's trip to X than we do to Y. It's not like that. And here's what I would say is this is just a point which hasn't been made yet, but I want to make now because it's a tribute to the leadership of both India and Pakistan. Just remember that 4 years ago, about this time, we almost had the first war in human history between two nuclear weapon states. And we were, in my judgment, within 72 hours of the initiation of large-scale military hostilities by India. in response to terrorism coming across that border, the attack on the Indian parliament, and so forth. Relations between India and Pakistan today are the best since partition. And that's because of 2 Indian prime ministers and 1 Pakistani president, not because of the United States or others. It's an enormous tribute to the political leadership of the 2 countries. So, as I said, I suppose such language may sell The Economist, a magazine which I read, but I wouldn't take it seriously.
Right over here.
My name is Rina Fonseca. I'm the Assistant Director of the South Asia Initiative here, and I teach in history and literature. And to follow that last question, in the past, whenever the U.S. warmed relations with India, of course, it suffered in its relations with Pakistan and vice versa. You know how much can change in 5 years. Can you look ahead for us and give us a prediction for what might, how this relationship might work in the next 5 years, barring anything like another 9/11?
Well, it's a good but tough question. Let me first say, though, again, how, and I can only speak on the Indian side of this and not the Pakistan side, but I have an impression it's similar. When I arrived in New Delhi and began to give dinner parties, small so-called round tables, where some of the people in this room, some of my Harvard colleagues have been at them, in which we put 16 people at a table and have one discussion about whatever it was, classical Indian dance, whatever it was. I had a standing joke, which was, how long would it take these Indians to mention the P word, Pakistan? And I had that amusement because if you talk to Indians in another context, they'd say, well, there are 1 billion of us, there are only 140 million of them. We're big, they're small, they're nothing to us. And we're absolutely fixated on Pakistan. And the record for a long time was 8 minutes before somebody would mention the P word. You can now sit among Indians for a very long time, including at Davos, and not hear the P word. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is India, its confidence, its spring in its step as a rising great power. But the other is what's happened on the political side between India and Pakistan. Now, 5 years up. Here, of course, cloudy crystal balls. But here, I think that relationship is going to depend more on Pakistan than on India. And I will now be controversial in my ordinary role here at the school, which is to say that India, the people of India and the politicians of India will never agree to a territorial compromise on Kashmir. It will not happen. There's no political support in the country for it. That remains the core position of Pakistan and especially of the Pakistani military. The big question mark over the question you ask is, under President Musharraf and however he sees this, will Pakistan come to terms with the fact that, one, there will be no territorial compromise, there will be no Pakistan flag flying over Jammu and Kashmir, but 2, that normalization of this relationship can open the borders, can make much less important which side of that particular border you live on, that people can live on one side and go back to the other. I don't know whether that latter model will prevail, and this will be debated and argued inside Pakistan. But I hope so, and that's the dominant variable in your question. If peace, if this trend toward peace continues between the 2 countries, there's enormous economic opportunity between the 2. The business communities of both want it to happen. Trade between the 2 tripled last year. It's still small numbers. Culturally, they have these enormous similarities, not to say their passion for cricket. And there's a lot these countries can agree about and cooperate about. But Kashmir remains this issue which is unresolved, so I don't know the answer to your question.
Can I just add one quick thing, which is to say, if you read about a month ago the the heads of the two delegations that have been having this ongoing dialogue for a couple of years now met. And you read any of the papers, they said it was a very disappointing meeting. And what everybody is beginning to say, slowly but surely, is that this is a stagnated relationship. We're not going anywhere. It's the end of progress, and it's going to go downhill fast. My only advice to people like that is this relationship has been antagonistic for 60 years. And in the last 4 years, since '02, there have been huge strides. So if you look at the relationship in a 60-year time frame, it's incredible what's been achieved. If you look at it in a 2-year time frame, why are we not moving faster? So I retain some optimism about where we're going as long as people can maintain their expectations at an appropriate level.
Right over here.
Arijit Sengupta, I'm a graduate of the Harvard Business School. Quick question about China and India. In Africa, in some parts of Latin America, it seems to be nations that are being shunned by the United States are turning to China as a kind of elder brother that can help them. And it's mainly around energy, mainly around resources. How does India play into this? Does it become a foil to China? Does it have its own position? How is it going to play out?
Well, I guess what I would say is that both India and China are enormously thirsty for energy. And I now, in my business life, am in the Gulf frequently. And the hotels are filled with Indian and Chinese delegations who, and it's true in Central Asia too, who are often bidding against one another. I don't think in a particularly hostile way, and actually I don't think in often a particularly geopolitical way. They're just trying to find energy resources to fuel this enormous economic growth in the two sides. So I don't think it's only competitive in a kind of pure business sense of who does the highest bid. I don't think it really has its application in Latin America. That's a very long way from India. And there are some Indian oil companies that are down there. I'd say one other thing, though, that you lead me to say, which I pointed at, is that as India looks at the world, first of all, it lives in a tough neighborhood. A neighborhood with wars, civil disturbances, Nepal, the tigers in Sri Lanka, what's happening in Bangladesh. We already talked about Pakistan. This is a tough neighborhood. So that's point one. Second is, as India rises, it has all the points of the compass in mind. To the west is what Indians call West Asia. The Middle East is what we call it. And we described that before. We have Southeast Asia, where there are Hindu temples throughout Southeast Asia, which were built millennia ago. Long cultural relationship, the Ramayana, for instance. And then China and Northeast Asia. So India, as it rises, will have a much more complicated foreign policy to conduct than it did in the past. Some of the people may look back with nostalgia on Bandung and those heady days when you just talked about being a member of the developing world and went to the United Nations and voted against America. Now it's much more complicated, but in most of the places I've mentioned, most, not all, most places, there is a wish for a greater Indian presence and influence because of the rise of Chinese power. They would like India to be more present, and I think that'll eventually happen. I just don't know what the pace will be.
Right over here.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Reiber. I'm a master's student at the Fletcher School. In looking at the nasty neighborhood in which India finds itself, we find Iran. If and when it does arm itself with nuclear weapons, what sort of strategic cooperation might we envisage between the United States and India, or is there any such cooperation that might?
Well, India now, according to the public literature, has dozens of nuclear weapons today. If the United States were to seek to assist India in its nuclear weapons program, it turns out this is against the law, not to put too fine a point on it in the Kennedy School of Government. So I would not expect the United States to assist India in its nuclear weapons program. The issue is more conceptual when you apply this, which is, and I'll just ask the question and you all can answer it or discuss it, which is this. Given a increasingly robust Chinese nuclear weapons program, which will continue to accelerate, one is reminded in that respect of Harold Brown's famous line about the Soviets, when we build, they build, when we don't build, they build. This is true of the Chinese nuclear weapons program now. In such a circumstance, would we, as some enthusiasts argue, like to see India without nuclear weapons? That is to say, vulnerable to permanent Chinese nuclear coercion. I would answer that question no, but it's a very, very controversial issue, and it's one in which I'm certainly not reflecting political correctness in arguing this. But it's my strong conviction that the Indian nuclear deterrent over the next 25 to 30 years will serve American vital national interests. Although India, of course, will be doing it for their own vital national interests.
Up here.
Hello, my name is Sanjay Inamdar. I am from Mumbai, India. I am an MPA student here. My request to you is to share your opinion on India developing its nuclear abilities further for peaceful purposes rather than going out and buying natural resources or energy oil from Gulf.
I think, it's a terrific question. I apologize for not addressing it. One of the animating reasons for the July 18th agreement was that, which is imagine an India that's growing in the way I described earlier, out in the international energy market in a situation where China's also out there with limited oil resources. This, of course, has its impact on the international price of oil. India now gets between 2 and 3% of its energy from its nuclear reactors. It plans by 2040 to have that number at 25% of India's electricity coming from its nuclear reactors, and perhaps even more. This will not happen in the absence of this July 18th agreement that we were talking about before, because India cannot acquire the nuclear fuel to run these reactors. So this is a big thing for all of us who care about how much we're paying for the gas at the pump and so forth, which is that it ought to be in our interest, also with respect to China, if not with respect to the United States, to have as much nuclear energy as possible. There's one last point. This is, of course, the school has rightly been preoccupied with the environmental effects of various issues of global warming. India, in the absence of civil nuclear power, is going to burn in the next 50 years an enormous amount of dirty coal. And again, this will have, in a country of 1 billion people, very great effects on the international environment. So, as this was discussed inside the administration, these economic and energy issues, which you properly raised, were very important.
There's two other parts to that. That if they don't get nuclear, then the pipeline from Iran becomes an absolute necessity, as possibly does a pipeline from Burma, neither of which are particularly attractive to the United States.
We just have time for 2 more questions. Right up here.
My name is Adish Agarwal, and I'm from the Fletcher School. You mentioned earlier the time limit of 8 minutes in previous Indian circles. I wonder what the time limit in Pakistani circles for the K word is. I guess I would humbly like to conjecture that the domestic pressure that exists in Pakistan for some movement on the K word, Kashmir issue, on that brought to bear on President Musharraf is far greater than exists in the domestic politics that is represented in India. Given that fact, my question to you is, what is the U.S. strategy, and what would the president be thinking when he goes to both the capitals and he's aware of, on the one hand, the Pakistani insistence of a greater role that the United States should play in trying to address the issue, and the Indian resistance to exactly the same fact. So what is in the policy memos that the president is reading on the plane?
Well, Well, I have one with me here if you'd like to come down afterwards and read it. I'm not going to address what's in the policy memos, but let me just do the substance of your question, because it is a good question. Pakistan, for 4 decades, has wanted American involvement in the issue of Kashmir, and for 4 decades, successive American administrations have refused, and they'll go on refusing. They'll refuse because, first of all, India will take part in no such discussion. But also, I would say here, and maybe there are even some contemporary examples of this, I don't think the United States has a comparative advantage in trying to help solve the problem between India and Pakistan. We do not speak the languages. We do not know the culture. We do not know the history. We do not know the religions, or the impact of the religions. We do not know the societies. Is the list long enough yet? This does not sound like a recipe to me for active American diplomatic involvement in this issue. It'll be up to them, and we'll see how they do.
Last question.
Madhukar Gupta. I'm a civil servant from India at the Kennedy School. I'm transported back to 4 years back when we had the build-up with Pakistan. I was district magistrate in a district very close to the border.
Oh, you were.
And the resentment of the people when the build-up took place and after 9 or 10 months when the army was disengaged, I think the time has come when politicians need to look at what people want. When the previous government lost in the parliament elections, not many people expected it. But then people were not happy. Politicians' priorities or perceptions about people's priorities were very different. I think a time has come when we need to put people first than our own priorities. The rate of re-election of politicians in India has come down to 28% now. The chances of a politician getting re-elected from any party are just 28-29%. So would you like to comment on that?
See,
don't you agree?
Yeah, don't you agree? Well, I think it was an expert question. Let me, before we finish this evening, though, vivify for you in a somewhat different way how far we've come. And you live this, so you'll know. In the spring of 2002, we had both armies fully mobilized. We had both armies at the front. We had a situation in which both armies were getting ready for war. And they were getting ready not only in conventional ways, but in unconventional ways. So much so that you'll recall that I took the rather controversial decision to evacuate much of our embassy. And it was the first time that the United States, in its history, had evacuated an embassy or issued a travel advisory because of the fear of nuclear war. It's the first time in American history. And we were very close. I conjecture, and I cannot avoid doing so, seeing Graham Allison, my dear friend here, and his fantastic book, Essence of Decision, that, and I will never know this, but that after we came so close in 2002 to a war between India and Pakistan, perhaps the leaders of the two countries learned what the United States and the Soviet Union learned after the Cuban Missile Crisis. That might have actually scared them. And what's interesting is that as Prime Minister Vajpayee and President Musharraf have reflected back on this, which they have in public, they have both said something different than they said at the time of the crisis. They have both now said they thought we were close, and with a sense of relief. And I think part of the reason for this impetus in the peace process is that it wasn't just the leaders who worried about it being close. And you were up there on the border. It was ordinary people. But I would say one last thing, which is, and this is the thing about India, is this great democracy, which is, if the people of India believe that their leaders do not sufficiently reflect what they want, they got a way to fix that. And they go to the polls and they fix it. and the world would be a better place, and South Asia would be a better place if there were more countries where that was true.
Can I just add one quick thing, just a quick anecdote? I was in Delhi and Islamabad and in Azad Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir 18 months ago. And the first question I would ask people is, well, not the first, but one of the questions I would ask was, if people here had a vote for independence, to become part of Pakistan, to remain part of India, what would they vote? And nobody had a good answer. There are no polls. But what they always, without exception, what they always came back to me, particularly in Azad Kashmir and in Jammu and Kashmir, was, we just want peace. We just want to get on with our lives. We want peace. That told me something.
Ambassador Blackwell, Zinnia, Normandy, thank you very much.